Welcome to our presentation this afternoon. We're so excited to be able to, again this year, do a student research symposium that showcases some of our students' best work in their research in the arts and humanities. We've been doing this now, I think, about 10 or 12 years, and so it's always a great opportunity to see what people are working on and have them present to us. So I wanted to thank, first of all, Kenneth Townsend and others who facilitate the Friday Forum for letting us have this kind of space, this time on the Friday afternoon. So we appreciate their support for this program. And I should mention, he wanted to make sure that I mentioned that next week's Friday Forum will be back more in the usual location over in the Academic Complex, room 215. And it is on education policy, some legislative, what was the word?
Yeah, legislative updates, preview, etc.
Right, so kind of a preview of education policy legislation. So there will be some legislators there, others who are interested in education policy. So that will be at 1 o'clock next Friday over in AC 215. So we hope that you can be there for that as well. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jason Rosenberg in our music department, who is going to tell us a little bit more about the program and introduce our three speakers, and then we will have them present for us. So, Jason?
So I'd also like to thank Kenneth Townsend in the Friday Forum series, as well as the Arts and Humanities Division, and especially Laura for helping organize a lot of this. We really appreciate this. There were so many wonderful, extraordinary submissions that we received this year for the 2017 Arts and Humanities Student Research Symposium. The papers that we received were judged according to a number of different criteria. They included the focus or unity of the paper, the strength of the thesis, the organization and development of the argument or arguments, the style of writing, the mechanics, the use of primary and secondary sources, and the significance of the project. The three finalists that we have here, Hannah Fitzpatrick, Emily Hussey, and Francis Lee, were chosen as the three finalists in this very intense and well-fought battle for to be a finalist in this symposium. All three papers are really extraordinary, and I congratulate you on your achievements, and we couldn't, as faculty, be more proud of all your accomplishments during your time here. I'd also like to thank the judges for their help in selecting these three papers. We've met a few times and had wonderful discussions and heated debates. That's Sue Carey Drummond, Ramon Figueroa, Steve Smith, and Kristen Tordello Williams. So a big thanks to all of them. And also a big thank you to all the students who submitted a paper, and for all of you for being here. A few quick logistical things. We're going to have each presentation be approximately 15 minutes. After each presentation, we'll have a short Q&A. So instead of having the Q&As all the end like we did last year, we're going to have a presentation Q&A back and forth. And then following the last presentation and Q&A session, we will then have a small reception with some refreshments out here in the lobby. At that point, I will total the awards, and we will make an announcement on the two award winners. The two awards are the best paper. This was determined prior to today by the judges, and then today's best presentation. For the faculty in the room, they should have all received a ranking order to help determine the best presentation. I'll give you one, Dr. Grun. And if you can please complete those and then hand them back to me, I will tally them up to determine who the best presentation winner is. And those will be announced again after the final one when we are in the reception. So thank you very much for coming today, and we'll begin with Hannah. So come on up.
Hi everyone. My paper on the commonalities of socialist realism and French Romanticism focuses on concrete, visible qualities of two works of art, and how these qualities reflect historical context, political ideology, and propagandistic intention. However, the goal of this presentation is not to simply lay out these details and connections for you to see. Instead, I wish to challenge some of your perceptions regarding the political economic theories and governmental structures mentioned and the societies and cultures they formed. I would also like to note that while I use binaries in reference to common thought, the strict dichotomies such as moral and immoral, and good and bad are difficult to define and vary from person to person. For the purposes of this presentation, I ask that you think of morality in terms of freedom and oppression, rather than in terms of religion or social acceptance. I would also like you to keep in mind that my heavier elaboration and concentration on socialist realism, as well as my use of only 2 works of art, stems from the guidelines of the original assignment. Socialist realism, the term first used in 1932, and French Romanticism from the mid-1800s are often seen as being in conflict, antithetical perspectives in both appearance and concept. This is not just the consensus of scholars. Indeed, most lay people would come to this conclusion when looking at examples from each category. But relationships between socialist realism and French Romanticism are actually quite evident. Both movements arose from commensurable historical contexts, the socialist and French revolutions, and used similar tactics and creative techniques to inspire the masses to support revolutionary acts. Despite their artistic resemblances, however, the 2 artistic movements are still thought to exist on opposite ends of a moral spectrum. French Romanticism achieved its purpose through complete freedom of expression and a disregard for the censorship enacted by the French government, while socialist realism at its peak served as a propagandistic tool regulated and commissioned by the leaders of the Soviet state. With knowledge such as this, it is difficult for many to acknowledge the possibility of these 2 art forms of being in any close relation. But perhaps the reality is that viewers see emphatic differences only because of pre-existing biases toward the Soviet Union's governments and actions. A comparative analysis of the paintings Picking Up the Banner by Galen Mikhailovich and Liberty Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix reveals that socialist realism not only recycled physical, technical aesthetics, but also emotional and philosophical aspects of French Romanticism, making them more closely associated than might be assumed. These works of art offer a lens through which to view political ideology and constituent freedom, a lens that can demonstrate that the notions of liberalism as moral and socialism as immoral are largely misguided. To fully understand the question of morality, good versus evil propaganda underlying this essay, a brief overview of liberal and anti-liberal sentiments is helpful. By the mid-19th century, classical liberalism became the dominant political ideology in Western Europe and the United States. Classical liberalism separates the individual from the masses by emphasizing personal rights, freedoms, and opportunities. These individuals exist, interact, and achieve success, or not, within a free market economy under what some call a neutral government, the liberal state, which is thought to lack its own agenda and solely serve as a protector for its citizens' liberties. Michelle Rivkin-Fish paraphrases Nanette Funk to address the fact that liberalism acknowledges the individual. It fails to recognize that individuals may perceive themselves as having duties to broader collectives. On the other hand, Marxist socialism, which gained momentum in Eastern Europe in the early 20th century, suppressed respective freedoms in exchange for collective rights, an attempt to erase social hierarchy, specifically the bourgeoisie. In his lecture, now titled The State, Vladimir Lenin criticized liberalism as a political ideology that created and encouraged systematic inequality, and that the liberal state is an apparatus for oppression of one class by another. He pines for a stateless collective society which he foresees the end of social discrimination. However, Lenin also recognizes the need for a socialist state, declaring, "We shall place this machine in the hands of the class that is to overthrow the power of the capital. We shall use this machine or bludgeon to destroy all exploitation." The socialist state does not remain neutral to its citizens, but instead acts as a provider of collective goods and entitlements, not just as a defender. Here it can be seen that while these 2 ideologies are vastly different, they both have the ultimate goal of bettering human life, and both ultimately fail to live up to the expectations, though few undoubting socialists or capitalists would agree. Following Napoleon Bonaparte's defeat in 1815, Romanticism began to explode across Europe and was particularly adopted by liberal French artists. French Romanticism became a type of nationalist movement that used art as medium to address the changes in everyday life due to industrialization, as well as a call to arms to finish the goals set forth by the French Revolution. The movement emerged as a response to the disillusionment with the Enlightenment values of reason, and became known for its dramatic and chaotic scenes, debuting a range of vivid emotions that had not been previously incorporated into the visual arts. Socialist realism arose nearly a century later under comparable circumstances. A large hurdle of the socialist revolution had already been won. The communists had overthrown the Tsar, and Russia was under the new rule of the communist state, just as the French had defeated the emperor and were under the rule of a new monarch. Examples of socialist realism can be found as early as 1917, after the Bolsheviks, a Marxist Russian social democratic faction led by Lenin, took control of Russia. In 1932 to 1934, the Soviet government, then led by Joseph Stalin, declared socialist realism the official and only art form of the Soviet Union. Like the French Romantics, artists of the Soviet Union used socialist realism to address the results of industrialization, as well as to encourage the proletariat to continue the fight for communism. Artists practicing socialist realism used genre scenes, acts of everyday life, to inspire the common man to look to a future made possible by socialism. This is what would start to define socialist realism. This outlook to the future stemmed from socialist theology. As Sheila Fitzpatrick states, socialism was the predetermined outcome. Socialism was the predetermined outcome of proletarian revolutions. Socialism would necessarily bring abundance and raise the living standards of all, hence a radiant future was assured. Though life in Soviet Russia was grueling, the people held confidence in their idea that their sacrifices for industrialization would soon bring them a higher quality of life. When looking at liberty leading the people and picking up the banner, a number of similarities can be seen. In Liberty Leading the People, Delacroix poses a barefoot and bare-breasted personification of Lady Liberty atop a body-strewn barricade holding the French flag. Both the flag and her dress wave in the wind, while she leads both worrisome and hopeful figures into a battle during the July Revolution of 1830. The dark blue and brown hues intensify the heavy emotions surrounding the dead and weary fighters. A white cloud with hints of golden sunlight illuminates the hopeful young pistol slinger representing the working class and the determined heroine, while the whipping of the flag and Liberty's dress emphasize the drama of the moment. Mikhailovich paints a reminiscent scene in Picking Up the Banner, in which an unnamed common man picks up the communist flag dropped by a fallen comrade in Petrograd. Both individuals are adorned in civilian clothing, denoting that this is a scene from everyday Soviet life. The man lifting the banner is dirty and injured, and his skin, nearly paper white, makes him look sickly. Regardless, his defined and likely idealized musculature does not fail him in carrying on the fight for Russian socialism. Cool colors dominate the canvas, reiterating that death and illness plague the men in the picture. The bright red of the communist flag contrasts with the rest of the painting and signifies the hope that socialism and the proletariat will prevail. In addition to the color schemes, symbolism of a national banner, and idealized nature, clouded by realistic forms of the figures, French Romanticism and Socialist Realism share an incredibly important and frequently recurring motif of the positive hero. The positive hero is one that has existed for centuries, but the specific term arose out of socialist realism to signify heroes that end suffering, not ones who continue to suffer from sorrow, from melancholy, from unrequited love. The positive hero is one that relates to the people by wallowing in their shared anguish, but instead rises above his or her own suffering to light the way toward a better future. Though the two movements both exalt in the success of the positive hero, they give them very distinctive figural representations. In the romantic work, Liberty Leading the People, the hero, or heroine in this case, is one of complete fiction, as Delacroix physically personifies the abstract concepts of freedom and liberty into a goddess-like woman. The positive hero of Picking Up the Banner is not as specific and allegorical, but is instead portrayed as an idealized, atypical version of the new Soviet man. The socialist realist hero was not lightly tattered perfection like France's Lady Liberty. In fact, he had his own struggles and ailments, making him more identifiable with his audience. He was obliged to work beyond human capacity, obliged always to strive forward to the bright future, obliged to withstand hunger, pain, torture, and illness. The obstacles faced by the socialist realist hero were the same as those confronted by the everyday individuals, but he, the socialist realist hero, was almost always male, was capable of overcoming them through limitless devotion to the party. The idea of unwavering commitment to the Communist Party mentioned previously, combined with the fact that socialist realism was headed by the Soviet state, leads many to believe that this art form is solely ruthless propaganda. In her essay, Everyday Stalinism, Sheila Fitzpatrick goes as far as to claim, in its crudest forms, socialist realism was hard to distinguish from outright deception. However, the relationships between liberty leading the people and picking up the banner make it harder to assume that socialist realism was any more propagandistic than French Romanticism, supporting Hannah Arendt's claim that Soviet propaganda was not as much about persuasion as it was about mobilization. Yes, it is true that Soviet state dictated guidelines that socialist realists used to shape their paintings, but it is crucial to remember that the Soviet people believed in the socialist revolution as much, if not more, than their leaders. For the people, socialist realism was an object held in high esteem. The art and literature that arose from this movement connected people across the entirety of the Soviet Union. Andrea Rusnak states that in regard to socialist realism, Soviet citizens participated in their own cultural education, not only through communal ownership of the paintings and personal possession of their reproductions, but also by making their own amateur paintings. Thus, art functioned for the masses and was created by the masses. Socialist realism was not simply propaganda put forth by the state. It was a trophy held high by the Russian people. They owned it collectively. They created it collectively. And the Soviet people infused their hopes and dreams into socialist realism more than the government infused ulterior motives. Although one emphasized individualism and the other stressed the importance of collectivism, both French Romanticism and socialist realism brought countrymen together, inspiring them to persevere through tough times and fight for their common values. Neither artistic movement was more propagandistic than the other. Neither movement was more righteous or innocent than the other, as is the same for the political theories from which they originated. Alexander Kollontai makes a salient claim stating, collectivism of spirit can then defeat individualist self-sufficiency and the cold inner loneliness of modernity. This collectivism of spirit is exactly what the socialist realism was trying to achieve. It was not just an attempt by a backward state to pull the wool over its citizens' eyes. It was not inherently immoral. Instead, socialist realism was a joining of the Soviet people through an artistic expression of their shared confidence in a socialist way of life, as well as their aspirations for a glorious future. Yes.
Thank you, Hannah. That was really interesting. I'm intrigued by the premise of your talk and what you're talking about, the moral issues underpinning these two works and the idea of propagandistic quality of them. And one thinks about an effective propagandistic image as being very clear, clearly presenting a particular idea so that there's not confusion about it. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about both of them actually in light of that in terms of how clear you think they are in presenting the idea. But in particular, the Delacroix, which was received with tremendous confusion and controversy at the time, partly having to do with underarm hair, which you can see up there, which is a really intriguing part of her as an allegory. Why does she have underarm hair? And I don't know whether you read anything of her body hair or not, but it sort of raises the issue about mixing up of allegory and reality there, that it makes the propaganda more confusing to the viewer. So maybe you can talk just a little bit about propagandistic clarity and how you see that idea operating in the Delacroix.
That's an interesting question. I don't know. To me, it always seemed kind of obvious. I didn't read much about the confusion. I just think the fact, like the emotional struggle that you can see within both paintings. And within that emotional struggle, you can see the idea of hope and carrying on, both physically as they're carrying the flag, but just this overwhelming sense of pushing forward. Here it's movement, but here in his intense gaze, you can just see he's looking towards something better. So it just always, I don't know, I always considered it obvious.
So do the flags, I mean, do the states that the flags represent, you're arguing that one represents a kind of liberal
Right.
monarchy, right? So what's the kind of state that is being invited in the Delacroix? And then you talked about the kind of state that's invited, obviously, in Soviet realism. But what's the kind of state you think in the Delacroix that it is inviting? What does the tricolor stand for?
So when this painting was created, they were in the midst of the revolution. And I'm sure many of you know, the French Revolution lasted quite a long time.
Well, it was I think it was the 1830 revolution, not the 1790 revolution, right? Is that right, Elise? Yeah. So it's actually a later revolution.
Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know a lot about the historical context. So here they're under a monarchy and they're trying to move towards liberalism. That was my understanding of it.
Thank you.
Yes.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the tension that exists in both of these paintings between, the hope, the working toward, a better state, making a great change, and then also the mortality, the risk of mortality that is evident there. Maybe something about, is there something about the collective idea that encourages people to be willing to take this risk of personal injury, right? Kind of this tension between hope and mortality and the individual and the collective.
Right. I think in both, the collective is important. The collective was definitely the ideal in the socialist realism. But in the French Romantics piece, it's more as coming together as a collective to gain individual rights, whereas here, they already think of themselves as a collective, and they're just fighting to keep it.
And so is that what makes you think people willing to just risk their own mortality?
I think that's part of it. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your paper. I'm wondering if you could say a little more about the gender issues, since I see this was for a class on gender and sexuality. Could
Right.
you talk a little bit more about that?
So, this is the first paper that I wrote for this class, as well as this is the first gender studies class I've ever taken. So, I don't know a huge amount about it, but I do know that in socialist realism, the male was the dominant because, they looked to their leader, they considered him a father, and then women depended on the man. It was very traditionalistic in that sense, even though they considered gender equal. In Liberty Leading the People, I think it just made more sense as her being mythological and capturing an idea to be a woman, if that makes sense. We refer to countries as female, things like that. That's my understanding.
Thank you.
Great. How about we end there and give a big thank you. And next up, we have Emily Hussey. I think your presentation should be right there.
Thank you.
afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to read my paper. I hope that's okay with everyone. But my paper / presentation is called Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, analyzing 3 modern interpretations and their significance. Before I get started, I just want to take the pulse of the room. How many of you have read or seen Taming of the Shrew? That's a good amount. Good. Good. How many of you have seen 10 Things I Hate About You? Okay, good, nice. And how many of you have read Vinegar Girl? 2, yay, okay. Well, I'm going to talk about that. Okay, great, thanks so much for indulging me with that. So to give you some context, I wrote this paper as part of Dr. McMaster's Theatre in London class. So one of the interpretations that I analyzed was the Globe version of Taming of the Shrew in 2016. So as you can see, our class was small but mighty. And if you know anything about Dr. McMaster, she likes to be the first one in the queue so that we can be literally on the stage, leaning, watching. So that photo right there to your left was me putting the camera on the Globe stage, was probably not allowed. But I just want to give you some context there. Okay, so for those who haven't read Taming of the Shrew, what is a shrew? Well, Shakespeare was not referring to a small, mouse-like mammal. He was referring to a bad-tempered or aggressively assertive woman. And I'm going to give the briefest of synopsis for those who haven't read it so that you can better understand the presentation. But do keep in mind that I cannot do the play justice in just a few sentences. So essentially, there's a man named Baptista, and he has 2 daughters, Bianca and Caterina. And Bianca is the youngest daughter, and she's being courted by several men. Caterina is the eldest daughter, and is being courted by no men because she is considered a shrew, or a fiend of hell, as mentioned in the play. And so these men want to marry Bianca, but Baptista has said that Bianca cannot be married until her older sister is married first. So a man named Petruchio from Verona decides that he will marry Caterina, but he's doing this for the size of her dowry or her wealth. So he decides to marry her, and he shows up late to the wedding wearing tattered clothes, behaves poorly. He drags her away from the wedding reception, takes her to his house, and this is where things get controversial. He does not allow her to eat, he deprives her of sleep, and he messes with her mind, essentially. And so at the very end of the play, there's this scene where Caterina is the only one who comes when her husband calls. And she gives this speech about obedience and how it's important for a woman to be obedient to her husband. And so this is controversial. And so a couple of, there's been a wide range of interpretations. Some people say that Caterina's final speech is sardonic, others say she's broken, but I'm just going to give you 2 opinions from some scholars, both from 1988, and I'm going to read them out loud. Shirley Nelson Garner says, taming is responsive to men's psychological needs, desires, and fantasies at the expense of women. It plays to an audience who shares its patriarchal assumptions. I find much of the play humorless. Rather than making me laugh, it makes me sad or angry. And I will add that this is technically a comedy. Harold Bloom says, the shrew is as much as a romantic comedy as it is a farce. The mutual roughness of Kate and Petruchio makes a primal appeal, and yet the humor is highly sophisticated. Petruchio is actually an ideal choice for Kate in her quest to free herself. So what do I think? Well, as a true moderate, I believe the answer lies in the middle. Excuse me, sorry. My thesis is that for an interpretation of shrew to be effective, it must maintain the integrity of the work while delivering a message not found in the text itself. And this may seem a bit paradoxical, but the real question here is, how can a work that's so apparently misogynistic actually be a feminist interpretation or a feminist work? And I intend to answer that question in my presentation today. So you may ask, well, what does maintaining the integrity of a work even mean? So I've defined it in 3 key elements. Number 1, there must be some type of conflict between the characters of Katerina and Bianca. And the reason why I say this is because I believe that one of the reasons Katerina acts shrewish is because of her interactions with Bianca. Bianca is kind of seen as the perfect little sister. If you have siblings, you might understand this. And so it's sort of like an acting out type thing. Number 2, Petruchio must be paradoxically unattractive yet appealing. And that's sort of hard to explain in a few words, so I'll get on with that later in the presentation. And number 3, and I think this part is critical, at the end of the interpretation, Katerina must be transformed in some way. I mean, the title of the play is The Taming of the Shrew, and taming indicates transformation in some way. So those are my 3 criteria, and I will be going through as I talk about each interpretation today. Okay, so 10 things I hate about you. A lot of you have seen this movie. It's classic. I'm a big fan. The IMDb description says a pretty popular teenager can't go out on a date until her ill-tempered older sister does. So this interpretation takes place in a high school. And so the Katerina figure is Kat Stratford. And Kat is she goes into the angry feminist trope. She is called a heinous bitch by her classmates, and Bianca is her little sister. So just going through my criteria pretty quickly, Kat and Bianca do have that conflict that I was talking about that I think is critical for an interpretation of shrew. At one point, one famous scene, Bianca calls Kat coming from Planet Weird, and Kat says, "Oh, as opposed to Planet, look at me, look at me." So I feel like that's a very classic scene. For the Petruchio figure, that is Patrick Verona, who is played by Heath Ledger, and he is that kind of paradoxical, attractive, or not attractive, but appealing. And this is, I guess the best way to describe that would be that he has an Australian accent, he has the bad boy swagger, but he was also accused of eating a live duck. So, you win some, you lose some. And finally, Kat is transformed at the end of the movie. She gives her final speech, which mirrors the final speech at the end of the play itself, and she is saying basically that she's open to love now and she's not hardened. So it meets my criteria in those ways. Okay, next we have Vinegar Girl, written by Ann Tyler. And so a little bit of context, this came out in June 2016, and I saw the Globe version of Taming of the Shrew in July 2016, so around the same time. And when asked about why she decided to write this book, Ann Tyler says, "People behave so inexplicably that you just know there's another side to it. Someone's exaggerating, someone's putting his own spin on things. Let's just figure out what really happened." So just quickly, Vinegar Girl does not meet my criteria. In this version, Katerina is named Kate, and she's a 29-year-old caregiver living at home. Her sister is 15 years old. Bianca, her name is Bunny. And they just don't really have that conflict because the age difference is too much. Kate's not really even a shrew in this version, or at least I couldn't really find that. Maybe the other 2 people who have read it in this room will disagree with me. But additionally, the Petruchio figure, this is what really makes me believe that this is not an effective interpretation, and that's because in this version, Petruchio, Peter, kind of serves as a savior for Kate. And I don't think that that's an effective interpretation because I don't believe that you can reasonably deduce that from the play itself. So Vinegar Girl kind of missed the mark. I think it was well intentioned. There were some moments that seemed to appeal to the feminist agenda, but it wasn't really. I didn't think it was the greatest way to do it. And so finally, I wanted to discuss what I found to be the most effective interpretation, and that was the Globe production of Taming of the Shrew in 2016. So Catherine Burns said, "On paper, this is a misogynistic play. One needs good reason to stage it." And so she found her reason through where it took place. So this this play occurred 100 years after the Easter Rising, whenever Ireland declared independence from Britain. And women were kind of falsely promised equality at this time. In the Proclamation of Independence, they were told they would have equality, and then 101 years later, they still don't have equality. And so that's where that was the setting that she chose. And so she skillfully utilized this setting to really demonstrate her points. She took inspiration from William Butler Yeats's Easter 1916, and in this poem, Yeats names a few of the men who were involved in the Easter Rising. He said McDonough, McBride, Connolly, and Pierce. But despite the fact that many women were involved in the Easter Rising, they were not named. And so what Byrne does in her production is she takes inspiration from Yeats' poem and creates a song numbered in a song. And so it says, "Can one man contain you all, one hearth, one little parlor? When you would burst this wooden O with all that you do harbor, you can act a different part from the one already writ, below from between the lines. Forgo the age-old script, you're a woman young all your days before, no looking back to wish you'd sung, be numbered in the song." And so the way she did this is the women in the play were basically howling, moaning this kind of song, pointing to the fact that maybe if they had been mentioned by name, the equality that they were promised could have actually happened. And back to my original criteria of the 3 things that make an effective interpretation. So Katerina and Bianca definitely had that conflict that I mentioned earlier. In fact, Katerina actually ties Bianca up in the play, as you can see in that top image. Petruchio is the paradoxically unattractive yet appealing. And at one point, he actually washed himself on stage, as you can see in that photo. And like I said, we were leaned up really close, looking up, and so we were trying to avoid the splash zone a little bit there. And then finally, Katerina is changed at the end of the play. She's in tattered clothes, she's wearing, she has mud all over her face, and then finally she goes and gives her final speech, and she has been tamed essentially, and she's giving it, and her voice is cracking with emotion. So I'm going to read this one part from my paper. In her portrayal of Shrew, Byrne does not eliminate or downplay the abusive scenes, despite the fact that they are deeply unsettling, and this makes the play all the more powerful. After marrying Petruchio, Catherine remains in her tattered, dirty wedding dress until the end. Her voice often cracks with defeat, most notably when she begs Petruchio for food and sleep, and during her final speech about obedience. Byrne utilizes these scenes to her advantage, demonstrating an important point about sexism in society. I assert that this production was successful because it delivered a potent feminist message without removing crucial elements of the original play. It utilized the controversial aspects instead of muting or diminishing them. So, the way that I see it is that this kind of lies on a spectrum of effective interpretations. These 3 do. I think The Vinegar Girl was not effective because I don't think that Kate was a shrew. I don't think that I met the 3 criteria that I outlined. I thought it was generally not an effective interpretation. 10 Things I Hate About You was a little bit more, it met the criteria that I outlined. It just seemed to be a little bit more of an effective interpretation. Yet, there wasn't really abuse mentioned in that either. But the Globe version, the one that Byrne did, was particularly effective because it took the original play and it didn't take anything out. But it's still the way that the songs were incorporated, with numbered in the song, the way that Katerina delivered her final speech, it still made an important point about sexism in society. So this is how I see it in effective qualities. It didn't mute or diminish it, it simply utilized it to its advantage. And so that's how I see it. But I will end on this disclaimer that this is my interpretation, and the wonderful thing about Shakespeare is that it can be interpreted a zillion different ways. That's why why he still exists today, I would argue. And so, you may disagree with me, and that's okay. And I'm looking forward to questions that challenge me. But thank you so much for listening, and you guys have been great. Okay, questions? Yes.
I have a question that's outside the scope of your argument, but I think it's relevant to it. I don't know the earlier history of the plot, but very often Shakespeare gets a plot from some older source, and then you can look at what he did with it.
Right.
Do we know something about whether there's some kind of trajectory of like the misogyny specifically in this story, when we look at how Shakespeare's treatment of it compares with earlier versions?
Dr. Franny is nodding her head, so would you like to answer that question?
Last year, I actually gave a presentation on this with Heritage because of the play that Peter was putting on. So there were very similar plots and other things right at that time and right before. And the main difference is that he does make it a little more complicated. Most of the other sources were very much just, it's clear you got to beat women and that's the only way to get them to behave. And that seemed to be just a very clear message from those. He does use some of those exact same techniques, even like the starving and the other techniques, but he does make them much more complicated and the possibility that there's some kind of sarcasm there. So yes, he did draw it from other sources.
Yes.
The story goes back to Genesis, right?
Oh.
The two daughters, and the youngest one isn't supposed to get married before the oldest one does, and so it ends with Jacob being fooled. So it's very feminist in the original story in certain ways.
I love the professors interdisciplinary bouncing off of each other. I love it. Yeah, misogyny is not a new concept. Okay. Dr. Smith?
Yeah, I'm struck by, I was looking at your statement up there on the screen and looking at words like defeat and obedience as a sort of final scene. And wanting you to talk just a little bit more about how that is construed as feminist. If the woman is defeated and obedient at the end, how can we interpret that as a feminist ending?
Sure, that's a great question. I think that the deeply unsettling effect that it has on the audience, the fact that she is defeated, and the fact that you're forced to confront in 1916 Easter Rising, I feel like that is how it is feminist. It's not feminist in content necessarily. It's just the effect it makes you confront the sexism head on. And I think anything that does that is pretty feminist. Thank you. Yes.
What role do you think the target audience had in the particular author's ability to stay true to the adaptation? The people who go to see a play, a Shakespeare play in the Globe, it's a very different target audience than 10 Things I Hate About You.
Oh, yes. Really? Oh. Yeah, sure. So with the target audience, I think that part of something that I took out of my presentation, but I had at one point, was 10 Things I Hate About You. The director of it was hesitant to put it on. He was like, interpretation of 10 Things I Hate, or interpretation of Taming of the Shrew. No thanks, who wants to watch that? And so I think that, you know, you do have to target it to your audience in the sense that someone going to the Globe is going to pay attention to the program that explains the 1916 Easter Rising, whereas someone, you know, watching 10 Things I Hate About You on Netflix is not really interested in the context. I mean, I know several people that I've actually talked to who don't know that it's based on Taming of the Shrew and don't really care. So it definitely matters in this sense. And also, I'll just tie in Vinegar Girl as well. Anyone who's buying Vinegar Girl is either a fan of Anne Tyler or is a fan of Shakespeare and Taming of the Shrew. So, you know, I'm sorry, I'm gathering my thoughts, but basically, I mean, I think it definitely matters, and I definitely think that the interpretation's effectiveness is critical and based on who you're trying to, you know, give the message to. Thank you. Yes.
Just kind of bridging off of that, it's interesting for me to think about, okay, so we're thinking about the target audience. It's different from the Globe Theater
Right.
than the movie, but the target audience, I mean, I was the target audience when that movie came out, and I loved it.
Oh, yeah.
But, I mean, it was teenage So how do you think that that changed the sort of the meanings of the characters and transformations that they go through about that version?
I think that with teenage girls in modern society, it's definitely a different field. There are certain aspects of it, like the within the parameters of a high school, and also kind of this pressure to fit the typical love story. You know, they fall in love and then like, oh, it's happily ever after, that sort of thing. And so I think that's sort of the limitation of 10 Things I Hate About You, is that as we're talking about the target audience, you have to appease them. It has to make it past these certain steps. And so there's only so far that type of movie can go with 10 Things I Hate. Taming of the Shrew. And so, and of course they couldn't mention abuse because that's not, easily digestible or sellable or anything like that. So, sorry, did I answer your question? Or
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else? Dr. Griffin, Shakespeare fanatic.
I like what you had to say about the sort of the unappealing, yet appealing.
Yeah.
Unattractive yet appealing quality or whatever of Petruchio.
Yes.
And also, you mentioned at one point that from a certain perspective, he can be viewed as kind of saving her.
Right.
Right. And so one of the things that makes Petruchio such an appealing character on stage is concerns the difference between his personality and every other male on that stage. Mm-hmm. The same is true of Catherine. The thing that separates her from these earlier shrew tellings is that she's intellectually she's the smartest person in the play, mm-hmm. in many ways, although he has a rough and ready quality with his taming and all that, but she's really smart. Mm-hmm. She has verbal gifts beyond anybody else in the play. And she has got a tremendous amount of sexual energy that she embodies. So I wonder if you had thought about the relationship between Kate and her father, and in the Interior of the Shrew, as well as in these adaptations, and measured that Baptista figure against Petruchio in any way.
Sure. Well, I think that Baptista, part of that dynamic ties into my first criteria of the relationship with Bianca, because I feel like it's a sort of a triangle. So that's that's my first thought originally. And as far as Baptista and could you repeat the last part of your question? I'm sorry.
Well, I guess measuring the Baptista against Petruchio.
Oh, okay. That was
as examples of masculinity, I guess.
Right,
yeah.
right. Well, I think that, like you said, Petruchio is such a and Kate and Catherine. They're so odd characters that you can really, the comparison is not necessarily on the same level, if that makes sense. So like they Baptista and Petruchio, like their masculinity is so different in the sense that Petruchio is just out there, unappealing, attractive yet unappealing, and really going for the money here. And Baptista is just like, okay, well, let me refine, calm, let me get my daughters married. So that's an interesting question. Hope that somewhat answered it.
Let's give a thank you to Emily. And next up is Francis.
Okay, hello everybody.
Today I'm going to be presenting my paper, Georgia O'Keeffe's Transcendentalist Spirit, which I wrote last year for junior seminar in art history with Dr. Elise Smith. And this paper was cut down from this presentation was cut down from a much longer paper, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask me at the end. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the handout that you should have gotten at the door. Please raise your hand if you did not receive a handout. Anybody? Dr. Rosenberg will take care of that. While y'all are doing that, I would like to thank Dr. Smith for her help with this presentation and paper, and Dr. McMaster as well. So yeah, I'll get started. Yes, okay. So Georgia O'Keeffe is a highly celebrated 20th century American artist who produced many notable works that are often considered to be American treasures, which generally depict objects and scenes from nature. And here you'll find some of her most well-known works. Georgia O'Keeffe also produced a body of written work, including a book that combines autobiography and art, and she also published many of her personal letters. Her writings reveal a transcendental spirituality and enhances the love of nature that she displays through her artwork. I argue that O'Keeffe was a transcendentalist artist influenced by the great American writers Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, and Henry David Thoreau. This philosophy is revealed in her artwork and is further explained by her writings and letters. Emerson's idea that nature is symbolic, Whitman's focus on reverence for nature, and Thoreau's move to Walden Pond all represent aspects of transcendentalism that are also conveyed through many of Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings. Ultimately, I argue that, while O'Keeffe is stylistically modernist, she has much in common with the transcendentalists, and in that way, she is also a romantic. Transcendentalism was a literary and philosophical movement in the 19th century. It defied the dominant philosophies of rationalism in order to emphasize individual understanding of the world. Transcendentalism is considered to be a form of American Romanticism. They believe that some universal truths transcend physical proof, and that nature contains many of these truths within it. The intimate connection between humans, nature, and the heavens was one of their key concerns. Emerson is commonly considered to be the father of transcendentalism. And if you'll look at the quote number 1 on your handout, you'll find that in an essay on poetry, Emerson writes that, quote, "Nature offers her creatures to the poet as a picture language. Things admit of being used as symbols because nature itself is a symbol, in the whole and in every part." This quote is central to the belief of the transcendentalists. All things in nature can function as a spiritual symbol. Alfred Stieglitz, a photographer and art gallery owner in the early 20th century, was highly influenced by the transcendentalist writers of the 19th century. O'Keeffe had a long relationship with Stieglitz, who influenced her career as a young artist. He led the Stieglitz Circle, which was a group of American modernist artists who focused on, quote, "the interplay between spirituality and art." Members of the Stieglitz Circle looked back at the transcendentalist writers for inspiration. Scholars have considered Stieglitz to be a, quote, "continuator in our time of the tradition launched by Emerson because he believed that the lessons of the transcendentalists could, quote, provide the key to understanding contemporary life." Though it is not clear whether O'Keeffe would have read the writings of American transcendentalists herself, she most likely would have been exposed to their beliefs because of her intimate relationship with Stieglitz and because reverence for nature and spirituality is shown through her art. Because of this, I argue that there are parallels between her art, writings, and transcendentalist philosophy. O'Keeffe especially connected with the writings of the father of transcendentalism, Emerson, particularly with his assertion that, quote, "the world is emblematic." This idea that the world is emblematic is central to transcendentalist thought, which I previously said. In his essay on nature, he writes that, quote, "parts of speech are metaphors because the whole of nature is a metaphor of the human mind," which is the next quote on your handout. The concept that everything in nature can be reflected in the human mind is similar to O'Keeffe's belief that she must, quote, create an equivalent for what I feel about what I was looking at, not copy it, end quote. To O'Keeffe, her feelings about nature and her experience of it become the emblem that Emerson was speaking of. O'Keeffe's Jack in the Pulpit series is an example of O'Keeffe's emblematic process of painting nature. On this slide, you'll see how Jack in the Pulpits appear in nature. This version of the Jack in the Pulpit by Georgia O'Keeffe is quite realistic, and if you'll notice, is pretty similar to the way that they actually appear in nature. This next version of the Jack in the Pulpit is more abstracted and is more focused on the stain of the plant. You can still ascertain that it's a plant, but it's becoming a little bit more unclear. This next version of the Jack in the Pulpit is more abstracted, and it's harder to make sense of what the undulating folds and swirls of color truly represent. And this is the final version of the Jack in the Pulpit, number 6. And what the image represents is unclear outside of the context of the series. The vertical form in the middle is encircled by a halo of white, which fades dramatically into gray, then to black, and finally to red. This image could represent anything. The vertical form of the painting is particularly powerful, and the colors are intense, features that could lend themselves to a variety of interpretations. I believe that O'Keeffe does not abstract her image of the Jack in the Pulpit for purely formalist reasons, but instead to show how nature can be transformed by abstraction into expressive paintings that can suggest a variety of symbols and meanings. Walt Whitman is another transcendentalist literary figure that Georgia O'Keeffe has pronounced connections with because of the links between his poetry and her artwork. Whitman rejected traditional poetry and created his own free verse form of poetic expression that wasn't limited to meter and rhyme. Whitman celebrated the freedom of the individual spirit, unbounded by the pretentious language and style of earlier poets. Modernist American artists in the decades following Whitman rejected earlier artistic traditions just as he did with literature. These artists broke away from the academic form of art and created their own form of expression. I see a parallel to O'Keeffe in his poem Song of Myself, which focuses on the celebration of the human body, the body's relation to the natural world, and spirituality. Whitman was inspired by the divine beauty of nature and revealed how he felt about its spirituality in his writing, which was also a concern of O'Keeffe's in her artwork because of her special relationship with the natural world. And here you'll see a picture of O'Keeffe photographed by Stieglitz enjoying the nature that she so often paints. This reverence for and appreciation of nature is also evident in O'Keeffe's writing. If you'll look at the next quote on your handout, you'll see that O'Keeffe writes, quote, "You know how you walk along a country road and notice a little tuft of grass, and the next time you pass that way, you stop to see how it is getting along and how much it has grown." I remember little things like that and put them in my pictures. Whitman was also fascinated by these little blades of grass, comparing them to, quote, the produced babe of the vegetation, quote, a uniform hieroglyphic, and, quote, a handkerchief of the Lord in Song of Myself. The connection between Whitman and O'Keeffe is not expressly displayed in the motif of the grass, but instead in their experiences of the grass. In both accounts, their experiences are important and reveal their philosophies. Though they have different perspectives, both are transcendental. For O'Keeffe, the grass represents the minute growth in nature that is small yet significant. She notices how much the grass has grown because she appreciates it as a living entity and gives it an increased sense of importance through painting it. For Whitman, the plant could represent anything, a uniform hieroglyphic that can convey a number of symbolic truths and meanings. This idea that nature can convey a number of different truths is transcendental as well. Whitman emphasizes the grass's spiritual energy and activity, especially when he connects it to a handkerchief of the Lord. I argue that O'Keeffe seems to represent this idea of a tuft of grass in her painting Skunk Cabbage from 1922. In this work, O'Keeffe combined the reality of the appearance of skunk cabbage with the energy of swirling, vibrant, and exaggerated color. The deep purple leaf in the center, with its pronounced curvature suggestive of movement, could be representative of the growth that O'Keeffe wrote about. The sinuous lines, contrasted against the form of the blue-green cabbage leaf at the top of the canvas, also seems to indicate growth. From the darkness of the swirling purple leaf emerges the bright vertical shape of the blue-green leaf. O'Keeffe paints the cabbage as a being that is growing and active. In the passage from Whitman about the grass, he also portrays it in a manner that suggests it is vibrant and alive, in the sense that it could represent anything that is living. Henry David Thoreau is another transcendentalist whose work relates to O'Keeffe's. He grew up in Concord, Massachusetts, but moved to Walden Pond in 1845 in order to immerse himself in nature and to, quote, test his transcendental outlook in the concrete physical world. In the next quote on your handout, Thoreau writes on his move, "I wish to speak a word for nature, for the absolute freedom and wildness as contrasted with the freedom and culture merely civil. To regard man as an inhabitant, or a part and parcel of nature, rather than a member of society. Let me live where I will. On this side is the city, on that the wilderness, and ever I am leaving the city more and more, withdrawing into the wilderness." Thoreau wants to find his own true freedom as a key component of nature. O'Keeffe's decision to move away from the bustling New York City to the New Mexico desert is similar to Thoreau's decision to move to Walden Pond. New Mexico becomes a place of exploration for O'Keeffe, where she could finally get in touch with the natural world uninhibited by city life and Stieglitz's influence. In this manner, New Mexico becomes O'Keeffe's Walden Pond. In this image of her home in the patio form, the adobe of her walls melts into the earth. Her home connects the sliver of blue sky above to the pale tan of the earth below. In this way, her dwelling becomes a place of spiritual exploration, just as Thoreau's dwelling at Walden Pond became a place for him to explore the universal truths of nature. In this painting of O'Keeffe's Ranchos Church, the ground also melts with the adobe of the church. These paintings show how intimately connected to the natural world even human spaces are in New Mexico. In New Mexico, the lines between the human realm and the natural realm are blurred, just as they were in Thoreau's home at Walden Pond. And here is a contemporary photograph of a New Mexico pueblo for comparison. When O'Keeffe moved to New Mexico, she began painting images of skulls and bones that she found on her many nature walks. O'Keeffe wanted to capture, quote, the wideness and wonder of the world as I live in it by painting these images of bones. In Ram's Head with Hollyhock and on the faraway nearby, the skulls are floating in midair and serve as a visual intermediary between the ground and the sky. Their horns and antlers point upwards to heaven and extend almost beyond the frames of the paintings. Here is a photo of O'Keeffe with another one of her skull paintings, of which she did very many. If you will look at the next quote on your handout, you'll see that on these paintings, O'Keeffe writes that, quote, the bones are as beautiful as anything I know. The bones seem to cut sharply to the center of something that is keenly alive on the desert, even though it is vast and empty and untouchable, and knows no kindness with all its beauty. This idea is reminiscent of the transcendentalist idea that things in nature possess a quality of truth and activity that connects the earthly to the spiritual. Though the skulls are from dead animals, O'Keeffe gives them new life by painting them reverently and giving them a sense of power. O'Keeffe's transcendentalist spirit culminates in her painting Ladder to the Moon from 1958. You'll see that on this image, O'Keeffe writes, quote, at the ranch house there is a strong handmade ladder to the roof, and when I first lived there, I climbed it several times a day to look at the world all around. The miles of cliff behind, the wide line of low mountain with a higher, narrow, flat top, which is the next quote on your handout. This suggests that the ladder connects the earth with its mountains to the world beyond, which is the world all around that she speaks of. I argue that this image sums up O'Keeffe's transcendental views on nature. In order to understand the spiritual world of the heavens, you must seek inspiration from the world of nature. The location of the floating ladder, evenly spaced between the mountains and the moon, suggests this ascension. It is unlikely that Georgia O'Keeffe was explicitly referencing any of the literature by Emerson, Whitman, and Thoreau that I have discussed in her own writing. The sentiments behind O'Keeffe's art and the 19th century transcendentalist writings are related because of their similarly held philosophies, not because of specific literary influence.
O'Keeffe's writings hold the key to deciphering her transcendental beliefs that are depicted within her artwork, which possesses a spirituality that I argue cannot be ignored. Though I believe that her transcendentalist influence first came with her associations with Stieglitz, she does not lose this transcendental spirit as she progresses through her life and her relationship with Stieglitz deteriorates. Rather, I argue that her transcendentalist spirit becomes even more evident when she moves to New Mexico to become one with nature and paints her bone images and ladder to the moon. Her immersion in the beauty and isolation of the desert allows her to get more in touch with the transcendental truths conveyed through nature. Thank you. Yes, Dr. Rosenberg.
You did such a beautiful job reading your paper, but there were two very interesting tiny slips that you said that I wanted to mention for an interesting reason. One, you said instead of appear, you said appeal. And the other time you said an abstract, instead of an abstract version, you said an abstract virgin. And this is really interesting because you very tactfully avoided talking about her relationship with sexuality. And this is really interesting because that's what most people like to talk about when talking about her theme. So I was wondering if you could just very briefly, because you clearly were avoiding it to some degree, but I think it's worth addressing to some small effort, the relation between her representation of femininity and sexuality in her artwork and this idea of transcendentalism.
Yeah, so when I was writing this paper, I initially wanted to come at it from more of a sexuality, feminism perspective, but I found that it was harder to talk about that when I felt that I didn't want to project my own reading. I guess I am doing my own reading of her artwork, but she explicitly said that she didn't want to be considered as a woman artist and instead just an artist, so that's something that I wanted to avoid in this paper, but I think that people's readings of, especially her very large flower paintings of Ionic is certainly valid, but yeah, that's why I was sort of avoiding it. Yes.
Okay. Yes. I commend you for not talking about it. Thank you very much for doing that. I was wondering, so it's really interesting because she starts making these flower paintings. Yeah, she does move to Mexico, but she's starting to make them in New York. So I was wondering and she's doing this as a conscious choice to kind of, set herself apart in this scene filled with all these male colleagues that are painting these big pictures of the city, all these abstract arts. So that is a kind of conscious choice to situate herself in those dialogues. And I'm wondering if the writers, which I know very little about, are doing if you're seeing that, if they're sort of choosing nature to respond to the industrial world, or in a similar way that O'Keeffe is situating herself in her context.
Yes, definitely. I think that the 19th century, there was a lot of progression and move towards a more industrial society, and especially Thoreau, he just didn't want to be a part of that at all and moved out into nature, and I think that those writers were definitely responding to that as well. And also, O'Keeffe, I think that she got a lot of her inspiration from her trips to George, which she and Stieglitz went to a lot. It was Stieglitz's family home in New York, and I think that a lot of her inspiration from nature came from that, and she was doing that while she was in New York as well. Yes?
You talked a bit about the relationship between O'Keeffe and Stieglitz.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious if you think that photography played any role in her sense of the relationship between art and nature, and the ability of painting to document this transcendentalism that you described.
Yeah, there's a really interesting painting by her called Radiator Building, and she does a series of paintings of skyscrapers and stuff from New York City, and it has the little I don't know what it's called, I'm not a photographer, but the little dots, that you get when you take a picture and the sun comes down. So she sort of imitates photography in that way, which is interesting, but yeah, I didn't really focus on that.
No, that's great.
But yes. Are there any other questions?
Let's give
Okay.
Chris a big
Thank you.